Hello and welcome back to a brand new character sculpt based off of the work of Chris Abels. I am Follygon, and in this video I will be going over my entire process used during this digital sculpt created in ZBrush. If you are interested in learning more about digital sculpting in depth, check out my Gumroad linked down below, where you can find my brushes, materials, as well as courses for absolute beginners and professionals alike. I'm going to be sculpting a stylized troll, and then I will be converting that into something more realistic. This is something I've wanted to do for a while, and, well, honestly, I'm just kind of really excited about this one. I don't get the chance to dip my toes in the realism pond all that often anymore, so this is definitely a fun little personal project for me. Because this character is only a bust, we will be able to focus in on the face a lot more during this video. There is a wide variety of forms when creating stylized characters, so I approach each one differently. For instance, the eyes of this character are created in a very different way than I would probably normally go about doing it. And that's because the design is completely lacking any real eyelids, especially under that really heavy top brow. But approaching things differently each time is kind of my whole thing. I'm very much about form being greater than formula. If you've never heard me say that before, it essentially means that formulas can be great, but they often stagnate our work and let many processes become automatic to where we're no longer paying attention to what something actually looks like, aka the form. So I really like to stress paying attention to form over trying to find a formula of how to do something specific. So during this entire blockout process of getting in those initial shapes, I'm paying close attention to the concept I'm working from, looking a lot at the silhouette, trying to gauge proportions, and just getting something on the canvas, honestly, as quick as possible. The faster we have something, the faster we can see what is wrong, and then start moving towards what is right. Once I get in most of the larger plane changes, I start sketching in some of the major shapes of the face. I do this pretty rough at first because I don't want to spend a lot of time working on something that I know is going to change quite a bit later on. So it's okay to be rough here in the beginning. And because I don't want this to be just a floating head, I give him a quick neck and a little bit of a trapezius shoulder girdle area as well. I add in some quick eyes so that I can start working on creating some eyelids, which obviously change a lot as I move forward. But honestly, that is to be expected. If you compare these early stages to the final stylized model, you can see a lot of the early shapes there, the foundation being laid right now. Of course, it looks a lot different because you're not going to get everything absolutely perfect in just a few brush strokes, or at least that's not how it really works for me. It's going to take multiple iterations to start pushing closer to your goal. In this case, that is the concept I'm working from for the stylized model. At this point, I'm starting to add more facial features while adjusting what I already have. I like to jump around a lot while I sculpt so that I don't spend too much time in any one area. So I'll place on some ears, spend some time shaping those into the rough idea of what I need, then I'll spend some time working on the nose and getting that shaped more appropriately. I still need to clean up the eyes and get rid of the awkward eyelids I've created. It's really a flowing process where I sculpt for a little, take a break, take a step back, and try to assess where I need to go next. I like this so that I don't end up getting tunnel vision and focusing in on one area for far too long, and everything else kind of falls behind. My main focus as I move into refinement is cleaning up what I already have, paying attention to plane changes and making sure my sculpt is following what the concept is doing. One thing that really helps is adding color to the model. Things really start to stand out when you do this. For instance, the cheekbone needed to come out and be way sharper of a plane change, and the color really helped point that out for me. So I spend some time making those adjustments. The eyes also need to be much smaller, but there are a few things I need to do to combine all of the parts for the head and the neck first. That way I can start blending between shapes and start getting that area to feel more natural. In those early stages of blockout, I often make things feel a little bit hard surface, kind of robotic-y, a little too sharp, right? So blending those and then starting to make that feel a bit more organic is nice right now. I was missing a few accessories with the hair and earrings, so I add those in really quick through extraction for the hair. Just something simple for now, of course, and then I'll kind of touch that up a little bit more later on. And then for the earrings, I append a simple torus or ring shape. Then it's off to transpose master so that I can adjust some quick proportions. His eyes were way too low, and it was making the face feel really squashed. All the facial features were way too close together. A pretty simple and quick change on that, which then allows me to start cleaning up and refining the shapes around my eyes moving forward. It's best to get the big stuff down first before moving into secondary shapes or any details, because if you need to make larger changes later on, it's pretty easy to mess the small stuff up along the way. At this stage, I'm thinking a lot about edge quality and how sharp or soft some of my plane transitions need to be. I'll typically start by planning things out to be very sharp, and then later on I'll soften specific edges to reflect what is happening in the concept. The edge of the brow is pretty sharp, and I do soften that later, but not nearly as much as I soften the current cheekbone, which is extremely sharp, just like absurdly sharp right now. But this is helpful for me to kind of figure out where my surface needs to turn and where these different edges need to transition. Now I'm still just creating a bust for the character, but I find it helpful to check proportions if you have more to compare it against. So I create a quick upper body for the character using my standard process of just slapping some spheres together. And I spend a little bit too much time slapping those spheres together and shaping this area up, because after I am done making it, I use it to kind of check proportions really quick, and then I toggle it off and never really use it again. So obviously I'm very good with my time management when it comes to sculpting. Next up is defining the location and shapes for the scars on the troll. I keep this pretty simple overall. There's not any one particular way that I, sculpt scars. Like I was saying before, let's focus on form over formula. So I'm checking out my concept and sculpting what I see. It's a pretty simple V-shaped cavity, so I carve a bunch of those in and add a little bit more visual interest than what is in the original concept, just so every scar isn't looking exactly the same, and then of course being repetitive and boring. And then I head up to the hair, which of course needs some attention. A lot of things kind of need attention right now. When I first saw this hair, I had really no idea how I'd do it, so I just kind of sat on it while I sculpted other parts of the character. Essentially what I end up doing here is slicing the hair into strips of geometry. Then I remesh those into lower poly strips where I can get in there with the Z modeler brush and start creating some secondary shapes for the bumpy look of what I can only assume are dreadlocks. I extrude in on some new strips of geometry and further manipulate some edge loops to get that look that I want. Nothing too fancy here really, but I always consider poly modeling to be very repetitive and boring, so we won't linger here more than we need to. I cut up the hair on the back of the head as well and add in a few tubes to represent the rest of the shape back there, and then jump over to the eyes to create the black eyelash strip that surrounds the bottom lid of the eye. I use my personal cube tube brush for this. There's a download link down below to my Gumroad where you can get that, and then I continue to fix some of the shapes around the eyes to line up a little better with that new shape. The original paint that I had on the face was feeling a little too flat, so I start adding some more depth. When I paint, I use a very low RGB value. It's really easy to overdo paint and push too far into essentially clown makeup. That low RGB value really helps to keep that from happening. A little more refinement to the scars using pinch brushes, and we should be good to move on to the hair with fiber mesh. The hair on the face looks way too thin and wiry to be a sculpted form, so I use a tool in ZBrush called fiber mesh to play around with getting something close to the concept. Now, if you're familiar with fiber mesh, you know that it's an extremely kind of frustrating tool to work with a lot of the time. There are a lot of settings in here, but mainly I'm trying to make something with the correct length and density to what I can see in the concept. I'm trying to get that as close as I can now so that I don't really have to manipulate it too much after I simulate it. I do almost the exact same thing for the mustache. I just make the hair a little bit longer and less dense. I finish up with some quick polish to just about everything to make sure there isn't anything big I'm overlooking, and then it's off to rendering. We will jump into the more realistic sculpt here shortly, but I thought it would be nice to take a quick break before we do and check out the final render for the stylized troll. In total, this stylized bust took under 5 hours to complete. That doesn't include sitting around waiting for renders to finish, of course. A little interesting thing here that I'll talk more about later, I used the exact same lighting setup between the stylized sculpt and the more realistic one, which you'll see here shortly, and actually the materials are almost exactly the same as well. And here is our stylized boy, yay! So fancy, I know, right? Hopefully you aren't just skipping ahead to see the final renders, but if you are, maybe go back and check out the sculpting process. It's a lot of fun to watch, in my opinion. Or just stick around as we now transition this stylized character into a more realistic one. I don't think I've ever done anything quite like this before, where I start with a stylized character and transition that into a realistic one. So I wasn't really sure how much of the form that I currently had would be useful to me. I think it actually turned out to be a lot more helpful than I thought it would. The way that I start here is with a clay brush by way of adding volume and focusing on major anatomical landmarks that were not present in the stylized version. And as you'll see, it very quickly starts to change into something new. I continue roughing up the surface to get my forms to feel more organic, and then I start honing in on some of the facial features and proportions a bit more closely. Obviously, there is a lot that needs to change for this to make sense. I break symmetry pretty early on because symmetry always feels so kind of unorganic to me, trying to break that up in the face a bit more to define some planes and soon enough fix some awkward proportions. But he is supposed to be a troll, so some exaggeration is not a problem. It's more so just in these early stages trying to push a little bit more towards organic and as far away from that stylized look as we can. You'll probably notice me switch materials a few times while sculpting. I do this to just make sure nothing is sneaking past me in terms of surface or silhouette information. Switching materials helps you refresh your eyes and let you look at things from a new perspective. It's very similar to if you were to flip your canvas in Photoshop. I was not having fun working on the closed mouth, so I split that off for a moment to give him what's called a mouth bag. This way I can get in there and sculpt on the lips without everything else getting in the way. This is essentially just a cavity for the mouth. It makes it a lot easier for you to kind of work on that area. It does have some downsides with geometry getting a little wonky and merged together in places like the corner of the lips, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. But overall, the benefits greatly outweigh the negatives. It just takes a little bit more work to do something like this. There was a lot of experimentation here with this character, but I would continue to overlay the stylized sculpt over top of this to see how things were kind of lining up as I went. I still wanted them to feel like they were the same character, but maybe created by two different artists. Next up is some painting, which I think is always fun. I went for some pretty high contrast on the eyes, just trying to make something fun here, hand painting a little bit of highlight and shadow, but not too much because I want the lights for the render to do most of that work later on. Then it is on to painting the skin. I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do here at first, but I really like the idea of keeping him pink. I start off by getting some subdermal color, which probably looks a bit awkward for people that have never painted skin before. You're just gonna have to trust me here. It will all come together here shortly. The idea is that I'm blocking out my colors much like I would for blocking out shapes while sculpting. Different parts of the face or just skin in general tend to be different colors based on if they are close to a fatty area, fleshy area, or kind of if you have a bone close to the surface. So there's a lot of variation there for sure. I am using a color spray to get a little breakup to the skin so that everything isn't one solid color as well. This often looks horrible on stylized characters, and I don't do it with that very often, but it works pretty well here. Skipping over a few things like re-adding in accessories for the tooth and the earring, we arrive at hair yet again. Our good friend Fiber Mesh, which I mentioned previously, is a little frustrating to work with. I do multiple passes on this for the beard, the mustache, the stubble, peach fuzz, the top of the head, eyelashes, eyebrows, which I don't even use. It's just a lot here going on at once. I play with this for quite a while because it does help add a lot of depth to the face. It looks pretty awkward in ZBrush because of how fibers are previewed, but I promise it will look better once we go ahead and render this. I do a little more skin breakup with a simple texture brush using a spray stroke. I try not to overdo this too much, but it is a troll, so he should have at least a little bit of gnarliness to his skin. And then after that, I'm a little more intentional with some textures for skin pores, wrinkles, etc., depending on the specific area of the face. Honestly, I don't spend a super long time on any of the textures because it's not really something I'm amazing at. I work with big shapes, and those are mostly where I want them here, so I'm happy to move on with pretty simplistic details here and there. You can see a little fiber manipulation here to reshape the mustache and to remove some strands that are not where they should be. So we have some that are kind of poking into the tooth, some that are kind of poking out of weird areas of the lips, things that don't really make sense or look too great. Fiber Mesh, like most automatic tools, is not going to give you a perfect result right out of the gate. You will always need to go back and fix some of the awkwardness or repetitive features from these kind of automatic tools. Same thing is true with alphas and textures. After you use one of those, or if you use them repetitively, it becomes more and more obvious, so it's really nice to go back over top of something like that and sculpt some additional detail. You gotta give it a little bit of the human touch or else it becomes very obvious that it was kind of automatically applied. One of the final things I do here is add scars. I use the shoulder as a little test area, a little bit of my kind of palette, and then I start adding them to the face. I try to make them a little bit more gnarly than what they were in the stylized version, but the technique was pretty much similar here to what I did previously, minus making them look a bit more organic and healed over. And yeah, that's pretty much it. This took less than 5 hours to transform into the realistic version of the troll, so it took about as much time as the stylized sculpt. I did have a little bit of the groundwork completed though, and honestly I wasn't even sure if that was going to be useful to me for this transition. It actually was very helpful, and I enjoyed doing that a lot. As I mentioned earlier, I am pretty much using the exact same lighting as the previous render, as well as the same materials. I make the skin here a little more wet, but other than that, it's pretty much exactly the same. You'll notice that the hair on the head is different, of course. Honestly, I just didn't want to make realistic dreadlocks, so yeah, here we are. This was such a fun project, and I've always wanted to do something like this, and I know I'm gonna do this again sometime soon. Hopefully you enjoyed the process and didn't just skip here to the very end to see the final renders. I know that is what a lot of people do, and honestly I really don't care, it's not a huge deal. But if you did, I would encourage you to maybe scroll back a little and check out some of the previous process. You might find some of it interesting, I don't know. I have a lot of other videos where I show off my process here on my channel. Those are linked down in the description to some of those fun recent ones that I know you'll love. If you'd like to learn more about digital sculpting in depth, check out my Gumroad, linked below, where you can download all of my brushes, materials, and I also offer some courses over there for complete beginners as well as experienced sculptors. In my course, The Appeal Academy, I work with people that are completely new to character sculpting, as well as working professionals already in the industry that are looking to level up their skills. Check it out, there's a link below. And if you're new around here, click that subscribe button. Let me know down in the comments which sculpt you preferred, the stylized version or the more realistic one. I'm always looking for new ideas and cool characters to sculpt, so if you have one, comment below. I would love to hear from you. And until the next time, you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.